ITIF, and I want to welcome you to an event here on getting next generation broadband to American libraries, which I think is an extremely timely topic, if for no other reason than it's obviously can be a key component of the Recovery Act and the Broadband Opportunities Program that NTIA and potentially RUS are considering. So we're really pleased to be joined this morning as principal speaker by Don Means. Don, if you don't know him, I'll describe him bio in a second, and then John Windhausen. We'll end as usual right at 10:30 sharp. We should have lots of time for discussion and questions as well. So Don is the founder and principal of a consulting firm called Digital Village Associates, and he has, unlike a lot of us, he actually has extensive experience in the IT industry. So he has over 20 years experience there. He's a co-founder, Digital Village Associates, a 13-year-old consulting firm. And his interest in this really stemmed from in June of 2000 when he authored a fiber to the library proposal to make the goal of connecting every library in the U.S. with 100 megabits connectivity by 2010. So we have 18 months to do that, and we'll see whether it happens. He's also been held as the senior position, political advisor to Meetup.com. He's also a chair of the Information Technology Association of America's Education Outreach Program, was a member of TechNet, served as a member of the Information Technology Commission of California. He's also a co-founder and board member of TriWorks Corporation, which is a Tokyo and Shanghai software company. And he has a long, as I said, background in science and technology in general. John Windhausen is the president of Talapoli Associates, which is a consulting firm here. John has spoken, it's probably your third time here, John, so you're getting to be a regular speaker. He's worked on...
Run away.
Pardon me?
I'm telling the audience not to run away.
Yeah, exactly. You will not be disappointed. John's been doing telecom policy for over 20 years in Washington, began his career at the FCC in the early 80s, moved to Capitol Hill in 87, served as counsel and senior counsel to Senator Fritz Hollings, and then Senator Inouye, and Democrats on the Senate Commerce Committee. He was key in the drafting and passage of the 92 Cable Act, 93 Spectrum Act, and Telecom Act of 96. And then in 96 joined the Competition Policy Institute General Counsel, and in 99 became president of ALTS, Association for Local Telecom Services, and in 2004 opened his own firm. So I just would make, I guess, a couple of just opening framing comments. In some ways, we've done a pretty good job in this country of schools, partly through the E-rate. According to the OECD report recently, the U.S. has the highest percentage of classrooms connected to broadband of any nation in the world. So I think when you look at our broadband accomplishments in the U.S., we have to put schools pretty much close to the top of that. We've done a pretty good job there. Not to say we can't do more. Libraries are a different story, though, which Don will talk about, where we simply have not done as much. And then the second component I'd add would be we released a report earlier, I guess about 2 months ago, called The Need for Speed, which the full title is, thank you, The Need for Speed, the Importance of Next Generation Broadband Networks. There's a copy out there. And in that report, we essentially laid out a whole set of examples and cases as to why next gen is important. And we did that because the focus of the debate in Washington is importantly, I think it's been too narrowly focused to unserved areas. And we think that it's really important in the broadband debate to focus not just on unserved areas or people who are not on the network, but also on speed. And I think this sort of middle approach of saying, let's get our libraries there first is an important component. One last point, and that's, I know sort of fiber to the library is sort of a catchy title. I think at least in our view, and I think Don probably agrees with that, really what we're talking about next gen to the library, and whatever the technology is that can get us there, and it may differ depending on library. It might be fiber, maybe even could be wireless, could be could certainly be cable, maybe even BPL, whatever the technology is. The point is to get very, very high speeds to libraries. So with that, Don, if you can sort of take us through your proposal, and then we'll hear from John.
Thank you, Rob. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming. Thank you for having me, Rob. This is great. You're your need for speed paper really was an inspiring document that actually was the reason I contacted you in the first place, because I saw so much resonance between the arguments the case you made and the environment, the platform that the fiber library idea would, I think, at least possibly support. I don't have any slides for you today. I'm sure they'll be a relief to most. I'm a recovering PowerPoint user. Let me ask, how many people have library cards? Please show me. Anybody willing to admit they don't have a library card? Okay. All right, well, good for you guys.
You guys could leave now.
Well, you know, would anybody like to take a guess at what the national rate is, the population at large? How many people have library cards? Don't anybody want to take a guess at that? Give me a number, please. Sir?
80%.
80%, that's bold. It's a little high, but it's not far from that. I think it's around 70% or something like that. So people love their libraries, but a lot of people, a lot of technologists anyway, I find tend to overlook them. They go, you know, I've got the Library of Congress and Google in my pocket, and I one-click at Amazon, so what's the point? I put this very question to Bill Gates about a couple of years ago. I said, he's done a lot for libraries through the foundations. What do you see as the future of libraries? He said, well, it's a good question. The future of reading, he said, would probably, the majority of reading would be on electronic devices. But that libraries were places where people could go to explore and share and learn. And I thought that was a pretty good answer. And that, in fact, is what they really have always been. Let me give a little background on kind of how this initiative grew up and where Digital Village originated, which, as it turned out, was in a library on a community college 15 years ago, or what we would have said would be 105 years ago if we were counting time in internet years, or how long has it been since you've heard anybody describe dog years as internet years? It seemed like the first 5 were internet years, and the last 10 have been like regular years. So something's going on there. But it was really a public-private partnership. Digital Village as a project was a public-private partnership, and where I live in Northern California, there are a lot of independent media developers, a lot of cast-offs from LucasArts living around. And at that time, in '93, was the dawn of multimedia as a CD-ROM medium. And there were a lot of titles being created, educational and entertainment titles. As a matter of fact, Microsoft just, I think last month, finally pulled the plug on Encarta. And if any of you wanted to go out and buy one, it's too late. But that they needed, as independent developers and authors and graphic artists and so forth, they needed to exchange files, and there really wasn't a good way to do that. So the idea was to co-locate, create kind of a business park for these types and have a local network that could do that kind of sharing. That quickly then led to the notion of, well, at about that same time, the web in its more or less current form arrived and began to satisfy some of that need. However, we are a suburban rural environment, and therefore not a first-tier market. So deployment in our county was competing with all of the other so-called second-tier markets. Well, that was when we understood, well, we are a market. This is this telecommunications infrastructure is a market, and yeah, as a matter of fact, there's a numerical value in a cell in somebody's spreadsheet that stands for what they think we're worth. So, maybe we should develop a strategy to increase that number, to make ourselves more attractive for the providers to invest in infrastructure upgrades. And that was really the beginning of the telestructure initiative. The community telestructure initiative basically says that telecom is an infrastructure. and it's the responsibility of every community to treat it as such and to do what it does with all infrastructure, i.e. plan for it and take responsibility for its advancement and development with whatever business model or technologies it might choose and for whatever local purposes it might choose. So that led to 4 years ago, now almost 5, where this initiative was launched as a consortium among TechNet, IEEE, EDUCAUSE, Public Technologies Institute, and ITAA, or what was ITAA at the time, calling on every local community to understand itself that way and to develop a formal strategy for its infrastructure development. Pretty simple idea, but still it's not widely adopted. This is an infrastructure that the local community has such a responsibility. But I think it's growing rapidly as the internet pervades more and more of our society. So the market approach to telecom, I think, is a really useful one, because we talk about, what is our value? Well, there is a value, and there's a way to, do a napkin level. This is my math. It has to stay on the size of one napkin, or it gets too complicated. But a napkin level arithmetic way to do market valuation would be to use the average household monthly expenditure for all telecom related stuff, cable, internet, phone, wireless, cell phones, which the California PUC estimates at about $200 per month on average. I don't think that's going to surprise probably anybody in this room, but that's for everybody. That's for people who probably don't even have phones. So let's just take that number and separate the HBO and the telephony and the internet connection, separate that from the connectivity layer, and let's just say half of that per month is for connectivity. So you can take that number, households times $100 per month, and apply it to almost any scale. So, for example, I live in a town of 7,000, 3,000 households. So that means we're spending $300,000 a month on our connectivity. So we could ask the question, just as an exercise, because there are a lot of interested in providing those services from different sources, but we could, as a market, we could ask the question, well, what are we getting for that connectivity? What are we getting for that $300,000 a month, our little tiny community of less than 10,000 people? And what could be created for $300,000 a month? Well, you could do almost anything for that amount of money if you were starting from scratch, right? Nobody is really at scratch, but if you were, it's a useful exercise. I mean, you could have fiber to the fire plug, and you could have wireless to the dog for that kind of money. And but it's an interesting exercise in valuation. Are we getting what we're paying for? Could we get more? What should we do about it? So that drives strategy. That idea of a local strategy was sort of the interim point, and then we, of course, came up against the general issue of a national strategy, or a lack of a national strategy. And so that then led to the idea of how could these local infrastructure plans be part of a national plan. And what we found in looking at it was that all these roads, all these issues of connectivity and use and performance and applications, they all seem to converge at the public library. And is a very useful place to think about these things, what their use is, what their value is, how to deploy them, who cares, and then access. So the notion of fiber to the library came up about 2 years ago as an idea to connect all 16,548 public libraries in the country with fiber. And I would say that fiber is sort of the ultimate, so start there. And if it doesn't work for some reason, then figure out what else would work. But it's hard to imagine a technology that would beat glass for future-proof. And I'll let John make the case for that, as ALA has done a fantastic job of making the case for fiber to the library as a technology. But the notion was that that this could be a deployment project that would inform the national discussion, and it would also deliver connectivity to as many places as quickly as possible for less than almost any other kind of project in terms of cash. The idea was developed in concert with ALA and the Fiber to Home Council, and also with the FCC. I presented this concept to Kevin Martin just over 2 years ago out in California. We were at an event together, and he got it. And he said, "Well, that's a great idea. I'm sitting on $7 billion just to do that very thing." He was, of course, talking about the Universal Service Fund. And I said, "Well, fine, let's do it." So we convened a workshop in Sausalito, my hometown. I put a plug in for it, and had the ALA and the Fiber to Home Council, the state librarian, the state CIO, the FCC sent someone out, and we spent a day beating on this idea. What was wrong with it, what was right with it, and more or less, it survived a day of kind of intense scrutiny and general endorsement. Well, since that time, of course, it has just sort of rumbled around, and then it was in mid-December, I believe, about a week before the holidays, a Sunday, just before the holidays, and the head of technology policy for ALA, his phone rang. It was the transition team. They're going, "Well, okay, how much? What's this going to cost?" And Alan Inouye is his name, the current head of technology policy, says, "Well, how long do I have?" And they said, "How about 24 hours?" He goes, "Oh, okay." So the phones and the emails started lighting up and trying to come up with a number, and in consultation with Fiber to Home Council and some other people at StringWire, $20,000 on average per facility was the submitted number. It may be higher than that. Recent figures are indicating that it might be. I just talked to the president of the Fiber to Home Council. He thinks that's a good number. But I'll let those two organizations sort of haggle over that. But it's something in that range. I believe we could accept that. So then we see a couple of months later, with the announcement of the stimulus bill, that right there inside of the law now are hundreds of millions of dollars for connecting public computing centers, which specifically means public libraries and community colleges, which I think means the library in a community college, which, by the way, is a public library. A lot of people, and me included, don't know that libraries in our public universities and colleges are public. I mean, anybody can go in and do what they do in a public library. Pull a book off the shelf, sit down, read it, do a magazine. They're open and free, which is a library tenet that I think is just essential. Just backing up one point about libraries, I was one of the people that also didn't have a library card for the reasons I just sort of listed. I had worked a couple of years before we started the Digital Village project. I had been on a consulting group that was headed up by Rob Glazer, who was then at Microsoft, advising the Librarian of Congress on digitization, which they were starting around '92 or so. And then it was really after 9/11 and the Patriot Act, when the librarians, our modest, reserved librarians, stood up and said, "You're not going to come in and check the records of our patrons on what they're checking out, FBI." It was an act of civil disobedience by librarians. I thought that really got me. And so I've been a big fan of these people ever since. They do tremendous work. And now in a stressed environment, it's even more challenging to be a librarian. You have to be, librarians are becoming job counselors now. People are coming in and saying, How do I do this? Where do I go? Oh, they only take applications online. Oh, okay, that's the new world, right? So these are really unsung heroes that I'm advocating for. But to get back to the business of the day, which is the Recovery Act and the stimulus funds for broadband, let me try to put this in the context of one of our popular symbols of the day, a pyramid. Only unlike most pyramid schemes that start at the top and then expand at the bottom, let's start at the bottom and build this one up. So this one starts with the Recovery Act, which is the spearhead of the whole agenda of this new administration, which we just elected. And at the heart of that $700 billion Recovery Act, I would say, is infrastructure, generally speaking. It's the thing that has the longest term positive economic benefit and has the short-term benefit of generating jobs, infrastructure. And then I would say at the heart of infrastructure is telecommunications infrastructure. Not just because of all of the great things that it does for commerce and society and distance learning and telemedicine, or a lot of the applications which we've been talking about for the last 15 years but haven't really developed, is the notion of smart infrastructure, all right? Smart grids, smart highways, that is all communications enabled. So we're not going to re-engineer our infrastructures, all of them, without telecom. So I would say that makes our telecom infrastructure a kind of a meta infrastructure, the heart of the heart of the heart of the whole Recovery Act. And yet the broadband bill, the broadband portion of the bill, represents only 1%, 7 billion out of 700 billion. Well, I would say that's wholly inadequate if the case I just made for the importance of it and the value of it is true, because infrastructure is trillions of dollars, and the potential productivity gain from using information systems embedded in our roads and sewer systems and everything should be on the order of the productivity gain we got from e-commerce 10 years ago. 10, 20% savings in efficiencies. That's trillions of dollars. So that justifies a very high investment, a much higher investment than $7 billion for broadband in general. So at the top of the broadband bill, the only identified institution specifically for which funds have been allocated are so-called public computing centers, namely libraries and public libraries and community colleges. And there will be, community technology centers, anything that I believe would be considered free and open to the public. Critical definition there, and one where I guess we're going to have some more clarification on, but I haven't heard anybody's definition that 80% of any public computing center wouldn't be a public library. So, to get back to the arithmetic on that, that translates into, of course, these hundreds of millions. There are hundreds of millions specifically for public computing center, hundreds of millions for demand side, and so hundreds of millions translates into tens of thousands if you divide it by, let's just say 20,000 facilities, roughly speaking. Tens of thousands for each one. So that's back to our starting point of the estimated cost of delivering fiber to all 16,000 libraries. And that's out and way out as well, where they don't even have any first generation broadband. But that's just for the connectivity. So it's some more tens of thousands for equipment and staffing you have to make this work. The last thing we want to do is put more demand on librarians and libraries by giving them something that they have to then spend more money and time supporting. We want to provide that additional support to go along with it. The obvious kind of equipment to use in such a proposal would be more computers, which would immediately expand the capacity, which is what the bill calls for, even if the bandwidth remains the same. But they would impact the space, so portables, netbooks, notebook computers is a logical kind of a thing to do. They could be used the same way books are used in the same space. Take them around within the facility, or whatever you want to do. It's your library. Let them take them home if you want. And then also high definition video conferencing is a logical technology to add to that mix, because that's the most common platform we've been talking about for the use of these next generation applications for telemedicine, distance learning, telework, and even gaming, I suppose you would have to include in that. So that's the general scope. The money has already sort of been allocated for this specific population. And so grants are being written all over the place to sort of go after general VTOP money. My concern is that all these city, regional, state grants are just assuming libraries. They're just folding libraries into their grant proposals, because it says libraries right in there. So it's an obvious thing to do. The problem is most of these grants will not be funded. Sorry, there's just not enough in $7 billion. So my worry is then that the libraries for whom money has been specifically allocated will not benefit, because they'll go down with the majority of the grants. So we're encouraging, wherever possible, library-centric grants to be formed that can be autonomous and even independent, but yet integrated and complementary with city and state grants. That's our general starting point, and that we're advocating. And then I will say, because everybody talks about, well, I just want to talk a little bit, we'll open it for questions. So everybody talking a long time, but I just want to conclude with the point that fiber to the library, besides being the cheapest, quickest way to deliver next generation broadband to the greatest number of people than any other idea I've heard, more economically than any other way, is a great idea, because it's not just delivering fiber to a bunch of nodes. It's actually open access points where people can experience next generation broadband and what it is and what it feels like. This is very much like what happened, at first generation broadband, that people had their first experience in a library, a streaming audio signal from a radio station in Taos, New Mexico, and they go, wow, I want that at home. So the idea of libraries as drivers of demand for broadband, next generation broadband, as early adopters of technology, not just for the trailing edge, sort of the default answer for the digitally divided, but a place where we can showcase new technology and foster the demand for it to be spread generally. So in addition to that part being sort of the best idea to make the best use of money that's limited, it gives us a project, a national project. And I don't think anybody else is actually proposing a national project under the Broadband Act. Regional, state, and so forth, but not nationwide. So this is a national project that we could all do, we could all support. It wouldn't be centrally managed, of course, because there's so many jurisdictions and different issues, but it could be commonly adopted as a goal, and it would be measurable, and it's achievable, and doable. And I think that's what we need as a country, is we need something we can do and prove to ourselves that we can accomplish. Something that might be, on the order of what we just did by retrofitting Hubble, with new lenses. I mean, that felt pretty good to do that. I think we can do that with broadband. I think we have to do it with broadband. And thanks very much.
Thank you, Don. John, you can talk from there or there on the podium, either one.
If I can stay here, that
you can, and I should also add, actually, I didn't add that one of your clients is ALA. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
So just to be clear on that,
yeah.
Which is partly why we invited John,
exactly.
Because he has experience there. So.
Right, thank you. Thanks, Rob. Well, I'm in the unusual position of being a respondent who agrees with everything that the main presenter just said. So I'm tempted to just say, yeah, like he said, and be done with it. But I wouldn't embarrass Rob that way. But so let me talk a little bit. And I will, as Rob indicated, I have been doing some work for the American Library Association, which has been working with Don on the origination of this idea of fiber to the library beginning a couple of years ago. Most recently, I've been working with them on a little paper to go into this in a little bit more detail. Unfortunately, it's not ready for prime time yet, so we can't release it at this date, much as we would like to, but keep your eyes out for that. But I can give you a little bit of a preview of some of the research and the findings that we've been discovering. First, with regard to fiber, Rob, you mentioned we're talking about next generation, and yes, in the big picture, that's true. And there are going to be remote islands off the coasts for which fiber is not going to be a practical solution, or the Alaskan bush. But I actually think that fiber is much more suited and much more economical than you might first think, and to be the technology of choice for an awful lot of areas. And one of the things that I'm learning, and I'm not an engineer, Gary Bahula, who's here, is an engineer, he can correct me, but when I first heard about fiber technology, I thought, well, that's great, it can provide 10 gigabits of traffic. And I thought, well, that's pretty good. And then I was told, well, no, John, that's not it at all. It's 10 gigabits for each color. And each fiber strand may have 100 or 160 colors being able to be carried off that. So I was wrong by an order of magnitude just on a single strand. And then when you consider that each fiber cable may have several hundred, or at least 100 fiber strands within that cable, then I think you may be able to give you a picture of what we're talking about, why we think that if you're looking at competing technologies, the amount of bandwidth that you can get over a fiber cable is so far ahead, surpasses anything you can do with any other technology. And if you're looking at the relative benefits, cost benefit analysis, and you've got two choices to go with a non-fiber technology that may cost a little bit less than a fiber technology, but that non-fiber technology is going to be outmoded in 5, 6, 7, 10 years. But if you spend a little bit more money, not a lot more, but a little bit more, and get a technology that's going to last you for decades, that would seem to be a very wise investment. And that's why I think Don and I and ALA are focused mainly on fiber to the library as the best long-term, most efficient solution to these needs. Now, I think the biggest question that people tend to ask is, okay, so the technology is great, is it realistic? Can it really be done? And this is a couple of ways to describe this. One is I just had the good fortune to come back from Michigan yesterday, or last night. And I was in Michigan at a summit that was put together by the state library, convening all the librarians in Michigan to talk about broadband and how they can do it. And I learned some interesting things. First, I learned that there are some libraries in Michigan that have already deployed fiber just in the last 6 months or so. And in fact, I was told that Jackson, Michigan, was found by Forbes magazine to be the small city where it's hardest to find a job. And in fact, of the 10 small cities where it's hardest to find a job, 6 of them are in Michigan. But Jackson was number 1, was the worst. Jackson, they've just installed fiber to the libraries. And I think that's because, as Don said earlier, people see it as a resource that they need to go to the library to find jobs, fill out their online job applications, get research on how to start a small business. So if the real struggling economic areas of this country are making the decisions to install fiber, and they're finding it to be realistic, I think that's a good testament. It's not just Michigan. I happened to stumble across this report coming out of Maine called A Framework for the Next Generation Maine School and Library Network. And this was put out by the Maine Department of Education. Maine is interesting because Maine was one of the very first states to create a school and library network. And they're now somewhat suffering by the fact that they were one of the earliest providers of this network, because now they're finding that network is being overcome by demand, and they just can't keep up. They've got to refashion the entire network. And I have to admire their bluntness here, and just reading from this report. To deliver the required capacity in the new network most commonly requires fiber optic cabling to each building. On the surface, this appears to be an unrealistic goal, but it is not. In fact, many schools and libraries already have fiber to their buildings as part of their cable TV franchises, although it is not often being used for their intranet access. And then the rest of this report goes on to describe all of the different ways, well, I can't thumb through the pages here, all the different ways that you can connect up to fiber, where there's a lot of fiber already in the ground, principally from the research and education networks that are crossing very close to many of the cities and towns in Maine. And when you start looking at the options of either connecting through your cable system or a private contractor to build your fiber to connect to the research and education fiber, the backbone, it becomes a much more cost-effective solution. So there are two examples of states that are looking at it very seriously and moving forward. Don, you mentioned the 20,000 figure. We've gone around trying to nail that down. We've had some estimates from an ILEC that said it was more like 40,000 per library. But one of these Michigan folks I talked to last night said they were able to do it for 10,000 or in some cases 5,000 for the library. For instance, if there was a fiber across the street that was easy to connect to. So the costs range quite a bit, but the bottom line is that it's reasonable. We're not talking about an order of magnitude difference in the cost. It's something that if we take advantage of the situation and really understand the benefits that Don talked about, it really can be done. Let's see, now there are a variety of ways or different scenarios too that you can think about for how to make this a practical solution. So the easiest scenario is direct connection fiber all the way from the ISP all the way directly to the library's front door, and that's certainly one of the options. Another option, if you can't get it all the way to the library door, you could get it halfway. And fiber to the node is not a good, is not the preferred long-term solution, but there are some benefits from even building it out to the node. My understanding is, again, not being an engineer, but having talked to an engineer as part of this project, is that if you can get fiber to the node, that allows you to get an Ethernet connection to the library. And there are a lot of benefits of an Ethernet connection because over a T1. A T1, for instance, which is right now the most common form of library access, you either order 1.5 megabits, a single T1, and if you run out of capacity on that, then your next option is to go jump up to 45 megs. And there's no sort of in-between there unless you order a second T1 and then have to get all of the equipment attachment. With an Ethernet connection, you can scale it gradually up from 3 megs to 6 megs to 10 to 15, 20. So you can order it in a much more scalable way that can provide you a more cost-effective solution. It also reduces the equipment costs because an Ethernet connection has a much more standardized mode of interconnection. So there's value even in getting fiber, beginning the process of getting it out into the neighborhood. That's a different scenario. A third different scenario is to consider not just a fiber directly to the library, but fiber serving all of the anchor institutions in the town, and maybe aggregate your fiber build-out. So you're not just serving the library, you're serving the school, you're serving the healthcare center or the hospital, you're serving the town hall. There's options there, and I think those are on the table as part of the stimulus package. Some proposals are to aggregate the usage and have a master fiber plan to serve all these community anchor institutions. Now, let's face it, libraries, as great as they are, right? And I think Don made a very convincing case. They're not the only ones that can make a really good case for having fiber. I mean, the schools and the hospitals also deserve to have very high-speed connections because their demands are increasing. Telemedicine and remote surgeries, and the schools with distance learning. Distance learning is no longer just a college application. It's increasingly in the K through 12 community in California. They've got a very extensive K through 12 distance learning program, and it's going to benefit from a fiber connection. And then a fourth scenario is this. Think of getting a fiber to the library, not just to serve the library's needs, but think of attaching a wireless connection or wireless antenna to serve the surrounding neighborhood. And so you could think of the library not just as the economic and social hub, but as the physical hub of a network serving everybody in that surrounding community, the residences of that community. That's a fourth way to make it, to take advantage of a fiber scenario. So all these things I think are in the mix in the stimulus bill. I'll just make one mention of the the approach that I think libraries are taking, and as Don pointed out, libraries have been specifically enumerated in the stimulus bill, not once, but twice. And it's the twice, I think, that I'd like to draw your attention to, because there is the $200 million pot of money. At least $200 million. So it could be more than that NTIA could make available in the VTOP program for expanding public computer center capacity. And that's a very, very wonderful reference to libraries, but also in the bigger purposes of the bill. There are 5 purposes, and the third purpose talks about anchor institutions generally, mentions higher ed, libraries, healthcare facilities. And what's really critical to understand about that third purpose in the bill is that it's not limited to unserved or underserved areas, as purposes number 1 and number 2 are that talk about residences. So what that means is that any library, any healthcare institution, any educational institution can apply for funding. They're not knocked out of the game just because the surrounding neighborhood may be served by a cable company or telephone company or whatever. If they can, now that's not to say they're all going to get funded. You still have to make the case that you need the capacity and you need that funding in order to be able to provide better service. But it does mean that you're not constricted by these geographic boundaries that may be drawn for residential areas. They don't necessarily apply to the schools and hospitals and the libraries in that legislation. So the last point I'd like to make is one of the other benefits, I guess this is really a 5th scenario that I think is a really important one. I mentioned that libraries can benefit from fiber. The surrounding community can benefit from having the fiber go to the library. The 5th way that the surrounding community can benefit is by allowing that fiber to be a link off of which you could build additional fiber facilities. So in other words, you build the fiber to the library, you make that investment up front, and as long as that fiber is open to interconnection, then you provide the incentive for others who may or may not get stimulus funding to build their fiber links, because now they've got a closer fiber point that they can connect to. So if you build that fiber into the community, then others may then have the opportunity to build fiber to serve the residences and the small businesses. So think of libraries in a lot of different ways as benefiting themselves from fiber, but also being that anchor institution that could help everybody get fiber. Thanks, Rob.
Great, thank you, John. We have a fair amount of time for questions, but I want to ask Don one specific question. There really appear to be 2 possible scenarios here. There's these applications come in and communities propose things and libraries get lumped into them, and some win and some lose, and so you get some libraries that get this. And then there's what you're talking about, which is a more targeted sort of do more communities but narrower applications in the sense of just libraries. If somebody from NTIA were here, which maybe they are, or you're talking to them later today and they ask you, Don, what should we do? How do we do this proposal? What would you tell them in a minute or less? How do you structure this to get your vision achieved?
Well, first of all, adopting the goal. I mean, as a generic goal, to encourage everybody to use that as a lead point in their thinking, because it's been identified, as John said, twice and specifically funded. So reinforce that statement so that people will orient to lead with the library that's been designated as opposed to just fold it in. And then look for and encourage ways for libraries to aggregate their demand by joining to create proposals that would cross jurisdictions, and then have those fit more or less the languages there today, that they're almost be guaranteed to be funded, and then that way every community with a library would benefit, even if the companion city or regional grant goes down. At least every community would have some benefit under the bill.
Okay, good. That's very helpful. Good. Why don't we open up, if you can say who you are and who you're with. And
good morning. My name is Howie Hodges, Senior Vice President for Policy at One Economy. I like your idea about kind of the library serving as the anchor tenant for fiber. You talked about that in terms of deployment. what do you see in terms of, say, the adoption strategy, or linking some form of adoption strategy with this connectivity to that anchor institution, not just at the library, but within the community that library might serve? We work with low and moderate income families, bringing both the access and adoption around the U.S. as well as globally. But we really would be interested in hearing some of your thoughts around, how you see kind of that fiber to the library strategy connecting with an adoption play.
Okay, John, you want to try that?
All right, I'll give it a shot. One of the, well, first off, stimulating demand is an important part of this whole strategy. And it's an important part of the stimulus bill. It's recognized in the stimulus bill. It's also a big part of what libraries do. A lot of libraries, and you can look for a couple of examples. The digital television transition is an example where libraries have been at the front edge of trying to educate consumers about what they need to do to convert to digital TV. So there have been a lot of efforts, and just, think about libraries are there. It's such a great place you can go to. You can always go and get somebody to help you. I mean, that's their job, and they're so good at it. So if you get fiber to a library, one of the, I think, the benefits is that then you could then demonstrate not only the benefits of the technology, which is great for the library, but then you could also help to educate people about how they could get this technology in their home. And so it doesn't necessarily mean how to use it while you're sitting there at the library, but also the library could have educational programs to say that these are the people that you call, whether it's the phone company or the cable company, or some independent builder or the municipality, in order to be able to get this fiber access. So the libraries are great because you've got computers that are all set up. You can help, especially for low-income people or elderly or immigrants that may not have the technical know-how. That can be sort of your first place that you go to start to get up to speed on the technology, and then expand it to your home or your low-income housing project or other very worthwhile needs.
I would add that that the implementation of broadband, of course, does nothing without equipment attached to it that makes use of it, and the equipment will do very little without someone that actually can support that, that can support users in the use of that technology, and can do training and development, professional development as well. So I think there's a big opportunity for nonprofits of all sorts to, or for-profits as far as that goes, to partner with libraries to bring in some of those services. We see in a lot of places there are library associations, which are not libraries themselves, but are collectives that are just for the purposes of group purchasing. Libraries purchase things in aggregated, to aggregate demand for reduced cost. There's a lot of history of that, and also related to professional development and support services, which I think will be critical. And again, if a grant included such services by whomever they were performed, coming in new to the library and not adding burden to the library staff, but rather supplementing those, whether it's training users on how to use the video conferencing system, or convening classes on various uses, or just having an open technology session. I heard one story, a guy, a technologist in Montana somewhere, and he initiated Tech Tuesday at the library. And so every Tuesday, or maybe it's one Tuesday out of a month, people come into the library, and he has some subject that he speaks on for about 10 minutes, smartphones or whatever it is. And then it's just open for everybody's sort of technology questions, which are all over the place. Like, why do I have 3 remotes to run my television? I mean, these are all relevant real-world issues, and it's very difficult to meet those needs with any kind of sort of class on basic computers or that kind of thing. That's also useful. So I think nonprofits of a whole range would make very good partners for the library. And another sort of image beside the pyramid I would use is a kind of a ball, and the library as close to a universal interconnect to every part of society as I can think of, for education, healthcare information, job search, general personal search, and so open to all kinds of roles as primary or at least secondary providers in everything that's listed in the priorities under the Act. So I would encourage anybody to seek out partnership with their libraries.
Rick, and then behind you. So.
Yeah, hi, I'm Rick Witt with Google. Don, I've spoken a number of times with you. I think this is a great project. I like the combination of boldness and achievability. I think it's a great combination. One of the things you touch on in some of your papers is this notion of transforming the library itself into something more like a technology hub. So all the complementary technologies you can use in addition to having access to the net and all of the information and connectivity that's available there. Could you talk that a little bit more here in terms of that vision? I think it's also another additional benefit that can be drawn out from this project.
Well, thank you, Rick, for the straight line there. Yeah, fiber to the library is a sort of it's a catchphrase. It may not actually be fiber, but why not? But it really stands for the notion of the library, as I think John referred to, as the technology hub of the community, and really kind of at least three new technology roles for the library. I mean, what are libraries? We talked about that in the very beginning. In a digital age, what is a library? Well, libraries have always been early adopters of information technology. Back to Ben Franklin, right? Books, very much in information technology. So I mentioned the role of libraries as early adopters of emerging technology, as test beds, see how this stuff works to help drive demand for it. Another role, a technology-related role for libraries, deals with helping people navigate the proliferating world of e-government. Applications are being created by every agency at every level of government, and they do not look alike. And it's daunting even if you have a connection, right? I mean, inadvertently, government, by creating these applications, is even widening the digital divide, because those applications that are being created, many of which have no paper analog. If you're not online, you don't have access to that public service. I would say inadvertent, but nevertheless, it is doing that. But even if you do have a connection, it's daunting. I mean, have you ever tried to renew your car license, with a handheld device? It's tough. But librarians are natural guides to information. So we're saying kind of the first stop for e-government, a human face for e-government, a person who can very quickly provide sort of the FAQ level of support for, well, this is the Department of Labor, this is the state motor vehicles, this is the local planning department. Somebody can guide you with that. Very useful. And then the third technology role for libraries we see is as first responder. In New Orleans after Katrina, there was the ad hoc communications recovery. All the cell towers were down, all the communications, electricity was out. People took portable generators and access points around to their libraries. And people, of course, naturally, without having it planned, figured out there wasn't a place they could go, and the neighborhood library just was the place they thought. And so they built a sort of an ad hoc VoIP and data network with wireless access points as part of their recovery. Well, why not think about that in advance? Because there are disasters coming, I think. And so why not plan for that? You're not going to the police and fire department in those kind of circumstances, but you need information, you need communication, and after you get that message out to your mom that you're okay, you really want to know about things that are happening to your neighbors. Who needs help? Who can you give help to? And so a strategy for a local communications recovery, I think, is very much in everybody's interest. And we're seeing some of that around, even that libraries could be sort of these emergency citizens communications network. So those are just three technology roles that libraries can play if they're wired and if they have the services and the thinking behind it.
Rob, could I just add one point to that? Yeah. We talked about the $200 million in the bill for expanding public computer center capacity. There are different ways of interpreting that. One way of interpreting that language is that it could go to the physical structure of the library building. So perhaps the library could add on an additional wing to add a technology center and become more of a technology hub that we were just talking about, Rick was asking about. That's one possibility, that $200 million could go to kind of physical bricks and mortar, and then libraries separately apply for broadband under the $3.75 billion that's left over.
It's a great point, and I think the deeper point then is that this offers the potential to drive the transformation and the reinvention of what our libraries are and what they'll be for our needs as we try to cope with this onslaught of technology that we're creating for ourselves.
Just on that point, we wrote a proposal about 5 years ago, actually, for creation of a national digital lending library that would be operated through local libraries. With the rise of the Kindle and other e-book readers like that, essentially libraries are going to have to get into that business of being able to lend you a book for a few weeks in a digital form. So that's another role the libraries have to really think through. And I think it's going to be hard for them to do that one by one. We need a national system to sort of help guide that. So I think, question right here, ma'am. Yes.
Yes.
You identify yourself?
Thank you. Linda Fruit, Internet Archive. I actually have 2 questions, if you don't mind. One goes to this question of the libraries transforming their role, and I'm wondering whether you've seen interest coming from the libraries to adopt this role and take on broadband and all these potential services, because we work with libraries all the time, and I don't necessarily see that, so I'm curious about that. And the other question gets back to this idea of a national strategy for applying for funding. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts on are who would coordinate that and how it would actually get done. I mean, who might write these coordinated grants, and to whom would they submit them? How would we actually implement a coordinated application strategy for funding?
Okay, maybe I can do those in reverse order, since I think the second one is more difficult. Consortia for grant writing are forming all over the place now, and as I say, libraries often do aggregate or associate in different forms, and I think this will be all over the place. I don't think there's any sort of central management solution for this. You've got, and I think smaller states, it's going to be more logical for them to aggregate under perhaps a state grant for the really small states, whereas if it were just a library-only grant within, say, Wyoming, it just wouldn't be big enough probably to satisfy the logistics of reviewing all these grants that NTIA and RUS are going to have to look at. I've only spoken to, and I think even John, except for this last part about, well, no, even that's under NTIA, just really that one NTIA portion of it. There are other parts of the ARRA that deal with a lot of things that could be applied to this, and ALA has done a great job in sort of articulating the different areas. In larger states, libraries that have associations that are sort of nonprofits are in a position to write a grant to do that. It may be, I think it'll just be all different kinds of ways, because we have as many different kinds of situations as we do states and as we do communities. So, you know, it's open to anybody. The law says, you know, they haven't excluded sole proprietors from submitting grant proposals, so anybody can actually do one. It really is a matter of cooperation, collaboration. If you can attain that and get commitments from the libraries, then you've got a grant group. As far as the first question, I think I heard you say is related to how libraries are taking to this. That also is a wide array of responses. But another role, another technology-related role we are seeing, I mean, libraries are, some of them check out more DVDs than they do books now. And they do lend ebooks. You actually can download an ebook today. It has a period of time, and then it erases itself, and there's some license of X number of simultaneous copies that can be used. So they're starting to be drawn into this digital age and what reading is about and what information is about. And also we're seeing libraries getting into, as Internet Archive is very aware, content creation. So a lot of libraries have digitization projects related to historical documents, photos, and local history. We're right around their library, which old newspapers and this kind of thing. So that's a pretty active area that's getting into technology, where content creation by libraries is not what usually people think about. They think of sort of archiving and ordering and making accessible, not content creation. But I think that's a new role for libraries, especially if we get video capability in there and you have little sort of ad hoc studios. That's new content. And so libraries leading sort of the 2.0 wave, or picking it up and making it more available to more people to create different kinds of content, I think is a new role for them.
John?
Rob, if I could come back to your opening question to Don about, okay, so if we think fiber to the library is a good idea, how do we do that? Or how does NTIA do that? And I've been sitting here thinking it's unlikely they're going to allocate to say 1 billion of the 4.7 billion should go to fiber to the library. But there's another way, and I'm just going to throw out an idea here without any authorization from my clients whatsoever. So don't, this may get me in trouble, but what if NTIA in the NOFA, that the Notice of Funds Availability rules that are expected to come out next month, what if NTIA said 50% of the scoring that you get for the application is dependent on whether you are serving these anchor institutions of libraries and schools and hospitals. So in other words, not 50% of the money allocated to these institutions, but your score, half of your score, so that it is going to be dependent on how well you serve these anchor institutions consistent with that third purpose. So all those entities listed in purpose number 3 in the legislation. Maybe that's a way, if they announce that up front, then you get people applying and writing their applications, but even before writing them, then going to the libraries and the schools and the hospitals and saying, look, not only do we need to say that we serve you, we need to build you into our program so that you're an essential component of this so that they can get the highest score possible. One possibility.
Sure. It's a good idea. I mean, it's implied, but to make it more explicit,
right,
make it even more powerful.
Hi, Ryan Wallace with Wilkie Fire. Moving on beyond the BTOP grants, and assuming all the libraries don't get wired with fiber, if you were the FCC in building your national broadband plan, what type of proposal would you make for Congress to adopt? And what, with respect to funding, should they use USF funds? Should they just say, okay, we're going to create we're going to earmark $7 billion to funding for libraries? And what benchmarks would you establish that you think are reasonable for having all libraries wired within a certain number of years?
It's a great question. As a matter of fact, it's the nature of a filing that I did with the FCC on this very point, saying that fiber to the library can serve as a useful tool for developing a national strategy, which necessarily is going to be some metrics on penetration, speed, and time. So if you can set those same metrics for 16,500 facilities, which you know where they are, and you know what they have more or less, if you can do that by such and such a time, that should help you then more easily set the larger goals. And so another benefit of having this sort of concrete national concept or project. And as far as the Universal Service Fund, you brought it up, but I think they should fund libraries 100%, but not in perpetuity. I think that if you can, after a period of time, using sort of the supply side, we saw how well that worked, right? And in first generation broadband, when we had unmetered use, I mean, that was a tremendous boost. People would spend time on the internet they never would have if that little meter, however few pennies it was going on. And we saw it in all the other countries that did meter So there's a real value in oversupplying to let people find and absorb that supply. I mean, we make a certain kind of a car because we have cheap gasoline, we have cheap internet, we're going to find a new kind of way to use it. It'll pull it forward. But I would say after 2 or 3 years that if a community on average of 10 to 20,000 people per library don't value next generation broadband at that community facility, then maybe there's something wrong with it. Maybe it's really not worth that much. But I don't want to get too far. I'm no expert on Universal Service Fund or E-rate, though it's a big part of how it's being paid for now. John probably knows more about it. I'm sure he knows more about it. He knows more about most everything.
Well, I don't know about that, but I can offer a couple of ideas. First, I think there's no question the Universal Service Fund needs to be converted to be dealing with broadband. I mean, that needs to, and I think that's almost a given with this incoming administration. So the question is how you do that. One idea, again, a little bit, I guess I can't say off the record because this is being filmed, but just to throw out for discussion, is for the FCC to say to Congress, okay, we'll take care of subsidizing the monthly connection costs of the broadband connection. If Congress, you appropriate additional money to fund the construction costs. So have them work in sync so that the upfront one-time costs, like in the stimulus bill, the $7 billion, you know, some of the Obama administration officials have said this is a first step, this is the first inning of a 9-inning game, implying maybe there'll be, if this works, there could be more funding to come down the road. Well, let's say this does work and we make progress. Maybe the FCC could say, you know, Congress, you appropriate the construction funds, then we'll subsidize the ongoing maintenance costs as the E-rate program does now.
John, I think the key there is for us to all hope for another major recession in 2 years.
Sure, I'm the only non-American company here, so I set up a foundation.
Identify yourself, Victor.
Sorry?
Identify yourself, please.
George Mihalis from No Foundation. I've been working in Sweden, Norway, France, and Japan, and in South Africa regarding not fiber, but how to develop what we call shared community facilities. And the central one was the library. So Norway has a very decentralized approach. Sweden is more centralized approach. And in several cases where they made huge investment in other small communities, 80,000 cities in Scandinavia, because the electricity companies, they go together and they invest money in fiber optics, oversupply. In one of the cases, they created several creative industries there. And the so-called oversupply initially, special facilities, high definition conference room, and also to develop the archive content, attracted international partners for what is called high definition content, digital archives in high definition. It's very difficult business. So in some cases you can't do it if you don't have the technology for it. So is this in your mind? So two questions. Do you see the possibility to map quickly an international cooperation scheme for your local communities? So then we have a pool of local communities from Okinawa, which I was involved with UNESCO to develop their high definition local identity, 25 DVDs, and now they developed a lot of business based on what the initial digital high definition archives in 25 DVDs in 2000 in Okinawa, they created in Japan, so that's probably the Americans know it, they created hundreds of jobs, highly qualified jobs. So this initial investment made possible because some of the infrastructure were in place, enabled the development of what I call high-grade creative industries. And this is new. So my question is it, could it be as an incentive? So this is business now, whatever we put it. We have partners for you in Europe, in France, in Sweden, in Norway, in Finland, in South Africa, in Japan. But the ideal thing, in my opinion, is to have your local communities become partner and to develop entrepreneurship innovation.
Okay,
And then,
right. Why don't we stop? Go ahead, Don.
Okay, well, thank you. My notion, I don't think it's mine only, but the idea of a library, a community technology hub, information technology hub, I think is universal, as I think the idea of a community telecommunications infrastructure strategy is universal. The smallest village with one satellite phone needs a strategy for it. And I think that really works at any scale. And as we know, sort of the rule of networks, they increase with value with each additional node. And there are groups that are developing I believe it's the Riken Foundation is setting up libraries in Central America, small, facilities. They're calling them libraries. They use satellite connectivity to get there. It's pretty expensive, but it's worth it, and it does that kind of. It becomes the core economic development strategy of the community, and I think it's a great idea. Not just because my wife is French and I'm doing business in Japan and China as well.
Gary.
Gary Bahula from Internet 2. First of all, let me just compliment Don and John for your advocacy. This is really a great idea. I did the quick math, and 16,000 times 20,000 is about $330 million. That's like less than 5% of the broadband dollars. So what a great investment that would be. And right now, it's clear that the bottleneck in the United States is the last mile to a lot of institutions, whether it's homes or libraries or schools and so on. And it makes sense to leapfrog in the technology to go all the way to the future-proof fiber. But if you did that, you also have to pay attention then to what is that fiber connected to? What about the middle mile, what we call backhaul, and the backbones that it connects to? Because if you hit a wall of a congested internet, then you're not going to be able to do that high definition video conferencing. You're not going to be able to do the telemedicine and all of the sort of great applications that always get cited in all of these proposals. The whole end-to-end infrastructure has to be upgraded in the country, and so hopefully NTIA will take into account your proposal, but use some of the other money to make sure that you can go somewhere from that library, perhaps to get to another one across the country.
I agree, and there's been a lot of talk about middle mile. Somebody was asked, I don't know if it was NTI or somebody was asked this the other day, well, okay, what's the size of the middle mile problem? Can you give us a dollar amount on that? He said, well, nobody really knows, but it's a lot more than 7 billion. But it is, as you say, unless the network actually can go out there, then you have, sort of a campus, even if it's a community, a local loop that is fast. Now that, in and of itself, is valuable because there's a lot of value in connecting a community to itself. Of course, there's much more value connecting that community or anybody in that community to the outside world. So that has to be solved. I'm not sure. Again, if it's the first inning, then maybe that's a priority. And what types of solutions there are and which kinds of networks might be leveraged that are already in existence to solve that, like the education networks and the state networks. I don't know. It seems reasonable to me. I'm just not an expert in it.
I would say what Gary has to say is a great idea, and I'm not just saying that because I work for him, but because there was a real need there. I mean, you just looked at the Bell Company's special access prices, and you get an instant idea that they have a very strong market position here in that special access, in that backhaul market. They're not facing a whole lot of competition. There's not a whole lot of backhaul facilities available. And this appears to be a big problem nationwide. You hear this from the wireless carriers making the same complaint because they're trying to purchase that backhaul capacity and are paying through the nose for it or can't find it. So the advantage that a lot of state networks have, that they've got backbone and they've got the experience, they've got a network, and so when I talked earlier about how if you got fiber to the library, it's easy to branch off from that to serve the surrounding community. The same logic applies to these state networks that have networks there, often fiber, and it's easier for them to branch off and dig deeper into the community to start providing some of that backhaul capability. Because you don't want to have a fiber to the library and then it's great inside the library and then you go out to the internet and you hit a brick wall where that middle mile problem stifles you. That would be an inefficient result.
I guess as the moderator, I think the problem is probably a little more limited than maybe what we've been talking about. We did a little estimate from the transition team at their request on trying to estimate this, and we came up with a very rough estimate of about 20,000 communities without essentially middle mile access. And then we came up with some estimate of how much it would cost to serve all that. And I think that's really the core focus. I think what we're seeing in DC with backhaul and middle mile is what is that for a long time that was bigger than the local, and that was the local loop, and last mile's gotten, and more people are, then that's becoming the congestion point. But I think market forces will get those to be built up and expanded to meet the sort of equivalency of the local increase in demand. I think the real question is how do you do with some of these more rural or smaller communities where they just don't have anything. I mean, we're talking about Brett Glass, who was talking about a problem he has out in Wyoming, wherever he is in Wyoming, Laramie, I guess, and he's got problems with his wireless ISP not being able to get backhaul. So I think that's really where I think the big opportunity or need is right now. Yeah, Paula.
Paula Wood, Microsoft. As hopefully speeds will get faster and faster, and we'll get libraries connected. As that happens, though, is there a challenge for libraries to deal with sort of the monthly costs for that connection? And if there is a challenge, are folks thinking about USF? How are folks thinking about sort of supporting that piece of it going forward?
Well, I think, yeah, the default answer for most libraries, I would guess, is the Universal Service Fund for perpetually paying for that. I'm sort of trying to make the case that there's an economic value to that service that's shared by those 10 to 20,000 people that library supports, that if that library can't show that this connectivity helps them make better use of connectivity in general and make the case for getting it to their individual premises, homes and offices, and for how to use it once they get it there, then I think that community should support it. They should pay for it. It would be 10 cents a person or something a month to support that individual library, some number like that. I'm just kind of pulling that out of nowhere, but it's not big. And so if it's not valuable, I don't know why it should be really subsidized, unless the community thinks it's valuable.
I would also add, just like buying a cell phone, when you get a cell phone plan where you cost of the cell phone's in there, the monthly fee is more. And I think when you subsidize the connection and the capital, the CapEx on that the monthly fee should actually be a lot lower because you're not amortizing the CapEx on the monthly fee. So if the subsidy goes to the CapEx, then the monthly fee in perpetuity should be somewhat lower and make it a little more affordable.
If I could just add to that also, the subsidy, I mean, the E-rate is supposed to do that. It's supposed to subsidize the library's connection costs. Unfortunately, a lot of libraries can't use the E-rate because it's so darn complicated. And the process for applying for E-rate funds is enormously intricate and difficult for libraries. And just to give you one example, the way they measure the E-rate discount for libraries differs from the way they do it for schools. So you can have a school on one side of the street getting E-rate funds and the library on the other side of the street that can't get E-rate funds because of the different ways that it's calculated. So the FCC opened a docket in, I think, 2005, took a lot of comment. ALA submitted an E-rate simplification proposal. Unfortunately, that hasn't been acted upon. That should be another part of the USF reforms that the next FCC chairman looks at, is how to simplify the E-rate process.
Maybe just a couple of last questions. Yes.
Just to build on that, the vast majority, as I'm sure you know, of E-rate applicants are schools. Well over 90% of PC, over 95%. And so it seems to me that there might need to be a policy shift at USAC to shift more attention to library connections. And so there's that issue. There's not just assistance for libraries in applying for E-rate, but then there's also, I mean, we've been through E-rate application, and the number of questions we get because of the lack of familiarity, like, oh my God, you guys are, you're a different creature than we're used to looking at. And so this problem seems to me needs to be approached from many angles in a coordinated way in order for libraries to be able to afford this kind of service and to support the service. There's the capital expense, there's the service support, potentially E-rate subsidized, and then there's a tremendous staffing question, which is funded from an entirely different source, taxes. So, I mean, I believe tremendously in this initiative, and I'm just wondering how we can bring it to the local level and provide kind of a coordinated portfolio of these are the applications, this is the series of things you would need to do as a library or a library consortium to be able to actually make this happen. More of an observation, I suppose, than a question.
Good observation.
Well, yeah, I feel like saying, like she said. I mean, it's a big problem, and I know ALA conducts E-rate training sessions around the country on a continual basis, trying to help libraries fill out these forms. The ones that seem to be most successful are those that operate on a consortium basis, where you've got a single entity submitting these forms on behalf of multiple libraries in the county or the region or the consortium. But it's sometimes the process is so daunting that it scares them away, and it's unfortunate because it's actually a program that's really worked well for those that can take advantage of it and be part of it. But an awful lot of people are, an awful lot of libraries just, it's beyond their means to be able to do so, and it's got to be fixed. It really does.
Well, I would just also add, you mentioned the staffing issue. I think one of the big things that we need to do if we ever resurrect Technology Opportunities Program in a sustained way, as opposed to the stimulus way, is we shouldn't be funding individual projects, I would argue. That this is different, by the way. What I mean is, or at least what we need to be funding is shared applications. What we have now today is each community center, each technology center is working out their own little standards and procedures and guidebooks and all of these things. And to me, it's a huge waste of money. What we need is, I would argue, some sort of, maybe ALA could get funding from the government to do this, but sort of shared tools that all the libraries, digital tools that they could all use collectively, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel each time. You see that with community technology centers in cities. I was talking to the woman who runs the San Francisco one, and she says, a lot of her time is just spent picking up the phone where other technology centers are asking them, how do you do that? Because they're in the state of the art. Can we copy this from you? They shouldn't be spending their time doing that. The feds should be organizing a real sort of set of tools that are partly online, partly off, to make that happen. So I think we have time for one last question.
I'm Cheryl Bruder from IBM. I had a question about the amount of knowledge of within the libraries. Which ones are already have fiber and which ones don't? You had mentioned earlier that as you go around, you learn about some libraries who've already been able to do this. Is there any overall inventory, either at state-by-state level, or is that just too complicated to get your arms around? But I'm just wondering if there's what the level of knowledge is about which libraries are already on the curve and which ones aren't.
John, I'm sure, knows more about this than I do, but IMLS just issued a report on broadband levels by urban, suburban, and rural libraries, and sort of which speeds.
What is IMLS?
I'm sorry, the Institute for Museum and Library Science, and they gave that breakdown, and I think ALA has just been updated recently. From what I know, roughly 20% of the libraries have fiber connections now, and I think very few of them are running above 10 megabits.
I think it's less than that, Don. I'm
Okay.
sorry, but I'm not an expert either. I think it's below 5%.
Below 5%.
And I think what happens is sometimes you get some surveys that go to the librarian and they ask, do you have fiber? And the librarian says, oh yeah, and my phone company told me I have fiber. So they check off the box, yes, and it may be that there's fiber to the node or fiber in their, or a fiber ring, but they don't actually have fiber to their doorstep. So I think that it's actually pretty small percentage of libraries that have fiber today?
So I have better connection to my home than 95% of American libraries.
There you go.
By a factor of 4.
There you go, right.
And by extension, 95% of the communities in the country, and 95% of the people.
No, actually, I think the people rate is, we've got probably, what, 15 million homes in the U.S. now with fiber. So we have connected more, probably more percentage of homes than we have libraries. But
We're
about 5%.
going to start sending patrons to your house.
I'm going to be one of these for-profit libraries.
So, good plan.
All right, well, on that point, I think we need to stop. I know, hopefully, Don, you might be able to stay a few minutes for questions for folks. So please join me in thanking 2 great presenters.